Hey friends, let's find our seats. It's so wonderful to see all of you here this evening. Just have a seat, get comfortable, very comfortable. So glad you guys are here. Welcome everyone. I'm Carter Sneed. I'm the director of the Notre Dame Center for Ethics and Culture, and I'm delighted that you've joined us this evening for the Center for Ethics and Culture's 18th annual fall conference. Our conference can vote now. We're very excited about that. Through every human heart on good and evil. Now, I see a lot of familiar faces, and friendship is an important part of what we do here at the Center for Ethics and Culture, but I also see some new faces, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Center for those of you who are joining us for the first time. The Center for Ethics and Culture is dedicated to sharing the richness of the Catholic moral and intellectual tradition through teaching, research, and engagement at the highest level across a range of disciplines. We do this through academic research, and of course the fall conference is the centerpiece of our academic programming. It's the greatest manifestation of our conference contributions to academia, and we also have a relatively new, robust publication series, several different series with the University of Notre Dame Press, in conjunction with our wonderful friend and partner Steve Rinn, the director of the Notre Dame Press. In addition to academic research, we have a program of student formation. We host a program called the Soren Fellows program, and right now we have about 200 undergraduate and graduate students whom we mentor, provide advice to, give special access to our VIP speakers, put on special events, and sponsor and fund a wide variety of summer internships over the course of the summer, all over the world, at the Vatican, in Congress, in Hollywood, all over the world. In addition to our academic research and student formation, we also are quite committed to engagement in the public square, speaking in Notre Dame's voice on behalf of the common good and human dignity and, of course, a culture of life. And then finally, and most recently, we've begun a new program assisting the university in its hiring for Catholic mission. We are now about to offer funding to departments on a competitive basis around the university to hire tenure and tenure-track faculty that those departments would like to hire, whose interests and commitments overlap with that of the Center for Ethics and Culture. So those are the sort of the four ways in which we try to share and embrace and transmit the richness of the Catholic moral and intellectual tradition, both on campus as well as off campus. The Fall Conference has become our largest annual event. It's a truly unique and exciting gathering of scholars, students, and guests from around the globe. It's become a wonderful opportunity to come together and grapple with some of the most vital questions of ethics, culture, and public policy today. More than 750 guests have registered for this year's conference, and we're looking forward to spending time in conversation and reflection with you in the days ahead. We have an extraordinary slate of graduate students, emerging scholars, colloquium, and invited speakers joining us this year. Now, on the theme of the conference, many of you no doubt recognize the allusion in the title of this year's conference, Through Every Human Heart. The great Russian novelist, historian, and Nobel Prize winner Alexander Solzhenitsyn used the phrase in the Gulag Archipelago in which he writes, quote, "Gradually it was disclosed to me that the line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through every human heart, through all human hearts. This line shifts. Inside us, it oscillates with the years. And even within the hearts overwhelmed with evil, one small bridgehead of good is retained. And even in the best of all hearts, there remains an uprooted small corner of evil." We wanted to explore this intractable problem of good and evil residing within each human heart and what it means for human flourishing and the common good. The theme, while of course timeless, took on special significance for the Center this year. We are proud to announce this year the launch of the Center for Ethics and Culture Solzhenitsyn series here at the University of Notre Dame Press, which will make available the works of this essential author, including works not previously translated into English, bringing Solzhenitsyn's prophetic voice to a new generation of readers. The first book in the series will be released later this month. March 1917 is the fifth installment in Solzhenitsyn's Red Wheel series, which Solzhenitsyn considered to be his greatest work, telling the story of the Russian Revolution. Copies are available for pre-order from Notre Dame Press in the publisher's room across the hall. Our thanks again to my good friend Steve Rinn, the director of Notre Dame Press, who did so much to make this collaboration with the Solzhenitsyn family possible. Now finally, just to close with a note of thanks, as always, we'd like to thank our generous benefactors, without whom none of our work would be possible. And in particular, we'd like to thank Tony and Christy DeNicola, as well as George Mays. To the fellows, students, and affiliated faculty at the Center for Ethics and Culture who helped make the life of the center what it is today, we'd like also to offer our thanks and gratitude. The staff here at the Conference Center, particularly Lisa Vervinkt and Eric Francis, as well as Kristen Garvis-Podell in the Institute for Scholarship for the Liberal Arts. And of course, I am blessed with the greatest staff, not just on campus here at Notre Dame, but anywhere in the world where staffs assemble. Mine is the best. In particular, I'd like to mention Tracy Westlake, Peter Lobsey, Petra Farrell. We just hired Peter and Petra. We call it the Petrine hiring. Peter is running our student programming, and Petra is running our Culture of Life initiatives. Kenneth John Hellenius, our wonderful communications specialist. Laura Nash, our Associate Director for Operations. She's the boss of everyone. And then I would like also to mention an extraordinary person on our staff who did more for this event than anyone else that I know, and that's Margaret Cabanis, who runs our academic programming and publications. Let's give an anticipatory round of applause to Margaret Cabanis. Of course, I'd like to thank all of our student workers, but I'd also like to thank the people who make this event possible. We'd like to thank the maintenance workers here at the University of Notre Dame, the janitorial staff, the food service folks, everyone whose names we might not know, who are working together with us to make this event possible. So now I'd like to introduce this evening's speaker. We could think of no one better to open a conference on good and evil than our dear friend, Professor Gary Anderson. Gary is the Hesburgh Professor of Catholic Theology at the University of Notre Dame, where he specializes in biblical studies with a focus on the Old Testament and the history of its interpretation, particularly in early Judaism. One of the world's leading scholars of Second Temple Judaism, he is one of the few non-Jewish scholars elected to the prestigious Academy of Jewish Research. His work addressing biblical interpretation among early Jews and Christians has won him grants from the American Philosophy Society, the Lilly Endowment, and the Institute for Advanced Study at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, where he served as a senior fellow last academic year, 2016-2017. Prior to joining our faculty at Notre Dame in 2003, Gary was the professor of Old Testament and Hebrew Bible at Harvard Divinity School. He received his Master of Divinity from Duke University and his doctorate from Harvard. He's the author of a number of books, including Sin, a History, Charity, the Place of the Poor in the Biblical Tradition, and most recently, Christian Doctrine and the Old Testament, Theology in the Service of Biblical Exegesis. Tonight, he will address the question, is the God of the Old Testament evil? Please join me in welcoming my friend, Gary Anderson.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. I have to say, I'm delighted to be here, but there was maybe one small point of disappointment with Carter and his staff after hearing all of the good words about them. And that is, generally when I come to conferences and give a paper, I'm always asked to provide an abstract of what my lecture is going to be about. And so one afternoon, I spent the whole afternoon kind of using all the best prose I could assemble in my mind for this abstract that was never requested from Carter. So I thought I would share it with you this evening. Is the God of the Old Testament evil? Here's the abstract. And with that, we'll begin. You should have a handout in front of you. If you don't, it won't be the end of the world, but the handout may make it easier to follow what I will be doing this evening. Every semester since my arrival at Notre Dame, I've taught our first required course in theology to the incoming students. My habit has been to use the book of Genesis as a window into the Old Testament. No sooner, however, do we arrive at the 6th chapter and the problems begin. The Lord, as we read in the biblical text, saw that the wickedness of humankind was great in the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. And the Lord was sorry that he had made humankind on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So the Lord said, I will blot out from the earth the human beings I have created, people together with animals, creeping things, and birds of the air, for I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the sight of the Lord. What kind of God is this? My students ask. With one sweep of his hand, he wipes out every living thing. What could be more evil than that? And things don't get much easier as we move forward. About a dozen chapters later, we come to the story of Sodom and Gomorrah and are faced with another episode of wholesale destruction. Then the Lord rained down on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire. He overthrew those cities and all the plain and all the inhabitants of the cities and what grew on the ground. Abraham went early in the morning to the place where he had stood before the Lord, and he looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah and toward all the land of the plain, and saw the smoke of the land going up like the smoke of a furnace. And then, if things are not bad enough already, well, there's always the book of Exodus. And the Lord said to Moses, go down at once. Your people whom you brought out of the land of Egypt have acted perversely. They've been quick to turn aside from the way that I commanded them. They've cast for themselves an image of a calf and have worshipped it, sacrificed to it, and said, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Israel. The Lord said to Moses, I've seen this people, how stiff-necked they are. Now let me alone that my wrath may burn hot against them, that I may consume them and make of you a great nation. The key verse here is obviously that of verse 10, which I've highlighted. God proposes to destroy all of Israel and to rebuild a new nation from the figure of Moses. Formally, this is exactly what took place during the flood. Though God had bound himself by an oath never to repeat that sort of destruction, Exodus 32 escapes the requirement of that oath by a legal technicality. In this instance, God is about to destroy only a single nation rather than the whole world. Yet the similarity is sufficient to shock the sensitive reader. The picture, in short, at this point doesn't appear pretty. At least that's what my students certainly take away. It's not just that the flood creates a challenge, but the story of the flood is repeated. Genesis 6 is not some rare and random act on the power of God, but appears to be something we might say baked into his character. But to anticipate where we're going, it's actually, maybe paradoxically, in this repetition that we'll find at least part of the solution to our problem. But now I'm getting ahead of myself. We'll return to that point, but first I'd like to make a few more general observations. As the German thinker Hans Gadamer once noted, the interpretation of texts is never governed solely by the manifest content of the text itself, as though the text were some kind of objectively clear set of signs that imprinted the same meaning on every reader. There is rather what he called a fusion of horizons at play every time a text is read. That is, the horizon of meaning provided by the text engages with the horizon of meaning brought by the reader. A challenge here is that frequently the reader is not sufficiently aware of what he or she brings to a text and ascribes profundity or barbarity to the text itself. What I'd like to suggest this evening is that part of the reason we are so bothered by these stories is that our understanding of the relationship of mercy to judgment is somewhat naive. We've been deeply shaped by what Philip Reif, Christopher Lasch, and others have called a therapeutic mindset. And one of the effects of this cultural demeanor has been the wariness of making strong moral claims about the nature of good and evil, specifically the notion that good should be rewarded and evil punished. A world shaped by the therapeutic process recoils at the notion of moral absolutes. In the theological sphere, this has resulted in the soft peddling of stories like the flood and setting at center stage stories such as the prodigal son. In short, elevating the God of the New Testament, here identified with mercy, over the God of the Old, here identified with harsh moral judgments. Now, I have nothing against the story of the prodigal son. After all, it's in my Bible. But I think we make a big error if we set the God of that story over against the God of the flood. What I'd like to suggest, perhaps somewhat daringly, is that even judgment can be merciful. But in order to appreciate this, I think we need to enlarge a bit our own horizon of meaning. And to do this evening, what I'd like to do is to show you a brief clip from the award-winning TV show Breaking Bad. Breaking Bad was created by Vince Gilligan, a man raised in the Catholic Church, and who has said in several interviews that the show deals explicitly with the challenge of living the moral life by persons who've rejected the reality of God. The scene we're going to watch could not be more therapeutic. It's set in the context of a 12-step program for those suffering from drug abuse. But to appreciate the dialogue that takes place in this 12-step group, we're going to need to know its context. And here I have to give both metaphorically and literally a trigger warning, because we're going to see a man pull a trigger. We'll hear a bullet, and it is violent, and I know there are people that would prefer not to watch episodes like this. I'll only say in advance that you won't see the individual who is shot actually be shot, but you will hear the trigger, so that is my trigger warning. Leading up to this therapy session, then, following on these thoughts, is a very disturbing scene in which one of the main characters of the show, Jesse Pinkman, fires a bullet into the head of a completely innocent man. This brutal scene is filmed brilliantly. Gilligan will put you right in the center of the action. No doubt this is meant to show how deeply troubled Jesse is about the task he's about to perform. And it is in the wake of that profound disturbance that he feels that we will encounter him later when he comes to the 12-step group, and that's the point of focus for me this evening. So listen carefully to how he describes in that 12-step group what he's done in the first episode from this clip. Can you show the clip? I was warned not to use this clip from Breaking Bad because to introduce a kind of academic lecture after that performance, I'm going to pale in comparison, but I'm going to proceed in any event. There are a couple things that I would like to flag in this little clip that you've watched. First of all, I think it's important to know that the drug world truly is an underworld. That is, most of us, I think, certainly speaking for myself, take the authority of our law enforcement agencies for granted. We presume at the end of the day that bad guys will get their comeuppance. And because we can presume that, we can go about our business without undue worries. But if we dip our heads below the surface of this civilized frame of reference, we'll encounter a very different world. And this, as Jesse attests, is a terrifying experience. For Jesse, killing an innocent man and then walking away without any consequence provokes not simply a moral crisis, but an existential one. He says, the thing is, if you just do stuff and nothing happens, what's it all mean? What's the point? These are questions about the very meaning of life, not just ethics. The leader of the group, obviously not in sync with the type of question that Jesse is framing, exhorts him to let it go, kicking the hell out of yourself, he says, doesn't give meaning to anything. Let me make an aside here. I don't think Gilligan here in this episode is critiquing a 12-step program on its own terms. Rather, I think he's using the occasion to criticize what happens when a limited therapeutic modality becomes a general worldview. And that is how I'd take Jesse's follow-up comment. So I should just stop judging and accept myself no matter what I do? Hooray for me, because I'm a great guy, it's all good? No matter how many dogs I kill? If you watch Breaking Bad, you'll see not just dogs, but a lot of people die in the underworld. I just do an inventory and accept? No, I don't think anyone, no matter how committed they may be to the therapeutic mindset, could walk away from this encounter not wishing for a display of justice. And even the group leader breaks character after Jesse's intervention and won't accept, that is, condone his actions. What we see in this episode, and I think this bears underscoring, is that before Jesse can be forgiven, and I think certainly he wants to be forgiven, but before he can be forgiven, his actions must be condemned. That's what he wants. He ought to pay the price for what he's done. Now, if we bear these thoughts in mind, I think the horizon of meaning that we bring to the flood story will be slightly altered. For after all, what God sees when he surveys the world at the beginning of chapter 6 is exactly what Jesse has sensed after slaying Gail Bedecker. That is, a world awash in violence and no judicial force sufficient to stem the tide. Most of us, I think, like Jesse, would agree that such a world would be unlivable. And as a result, in Genesis 6, God hits the reset button, so to speak, and creates a new world from a better moral stock, the loins of Noah. But in Genesis, all is still not well. Just one story later, human beings are back to their mischief building the Tower of Babel. God sees the danger looming, but this time is unable to send another flood, so he does the next best thing. He mixes up the languages so that no single nation can exercise totalitarian power over the others. He creates, we might say, a system of checks and balances so that human wickedness can be controlled, even if it can't be eliminated. But what about the story of the golden calf? This story again raises its ugly head. However much we might be able to domesticate the wrath of God during the flood, God's return to such an overly wrought emotional state at Mount Sinai would seem to present an unsurmountable obstacle, especially given the fact that the story is so clearly patterned, at least in part, on the story of the flood itself. But there is a significant difference between these two stories. Noah, though a survivor of the flood, achieves this end by and large in a passive fashion. Here you might want to flip your handout over to page 2. Yes, of course Noah built the ark. He loaded the animals into it. But Noah took no stance for or against what God proposed to do. Not to put too fine a point on it, but we could say that Noah was simply going along for the ride. Whereas Noah was remembered by God, God being the active agent of remembering here, Moses simply the beneficiary of the action. Moses, on the other hand, stridently demands that God remember his prior commitments. Remember Abraham, Isaac, Israel, your servants. Moses has addressed the impending cataclysm very differently than Noah. And how do we account for this? Well, let's look a little bit closer at our text. In Exodus 32, Moses, unlike Noah, is taken into God's confidence and consulted about what is going to transpire. Now, had God simply wished to execute judgment, he would have said this: I see that this is a stiff-necked people, and so my anger shall blaze forth against them and destroy them, and I will make of you a great nation. This sentence describes a unilateral action on the part of God. But that's not the book of Exodus. What God actually says is this: I see that this is a stiff-necked people. Now let me be, that my anger may blaze forth, and so forth. Oddly, God is requesting Moses' permission before he proceeds. A Jewish tradition captures, I think, quite excellently the tonality of this sentence. Now let me be, quoting the verse from Exodus, that my anger may blaze forth against them and destroy them. To what can we compare this? To a king who, being angry at his son, placed him in a small room and is about to strike him. But at the same time, the king cried out for someone to stop him. The son's tutor, who was standing outside, said to himself, the king and his son are in the room. Why does the king say, stop me? It must be that the king wants me to go into the room and bring about a reconciliation. In a similar way, God says to Moses, let me be. And Moses said, because God wants me to defend Israel, he says, let me be. And Moses then immediately interceded for them. But it's not solely that God requested Moses' help in this manner, but God also signaled the manner by which Moses could be most effective. God tells Moses that should he leave him alone, he will make of him a great nation. But this way of putting the matter clearly calls to mind an earlier promise God had made back in Genesis 12 to make of Abraham and his successors a great nation. Moses, ever the skillful interlocutor, recounts the nature in which God bound himself to this people when he first promised to make them a great nation. He says, slide went too quickly. Let's keep our hand out. Remember your servants, Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, how you swore to them by yourself and said to them, I will make your offspring as numerous as the stars of heaven, and I will give to your offspring this whole land of which I spoke. Having been reminded of his obligations, God then, in verse 14, renounces the punishment he had planned to make. He renounced the punishment he had planned to bring upon his people. End of the verse. A key feature of this narrative is the representational role that Moses plays. As the great Jewish biblical scholar Yochanan Mufs has argued, Moses here is not simply an exemplary human being standing before God. Rather, what Mufs argued is that Moses is representing part of God to God. He assumes a part of the divine personality such that one cannot properly pick out the full identity of God by only attending to what the subject identified by God in the story says. Let's pause for a second on this issue. If we look at the chapter as it literally presents itself, we have our two characters, the Lord and Moses. Each have speeches proper to each character. But what Mufs is suggesting is that what Moses says is what God wants him to say in advance. In essence, the figure of God, not grammatically, but we might want to say semiotically, is represented by the two pieces of this conversation, such that one could gloss it this way. The Lord, speaking in his own voice, said, I have seen this people, how stiff-necked they are. Now let me alone. But then the Lord thought, speaking in persona Moses, why does your wrath burn? And God, getting the better half of himself, renounces the punishment he had intended. Mufs writes, God allows the prophet to represent in his prayer his own attribute of mercy, the very element that enables a calming of God's angry and vindictive feelings. Because the prophet then is a necessary and non-negotiable element in the rendering of the identity of God, a Jewish midrash can go so far as to say that God wept when Moses was ready to hand over his soul to death. God said, Who will stand against me on the day of my wrath? This means, who will protect Israel in the hour of my anger? Who will speak up for them when they sin against me? Moses, on this understanding, is a necessary actor in the narrative that depicts God's character. The identity of God would look very different were he not on the scene. One of the issues that this story then establishes, I would like to argue, basing myself on what Yochanan Muffs has already written, is the necessary role of intercessory prayer. If one thinks about it, intercessory prayer is an odd thing. Does God really need me to remind him that my Aunt Myrtle, for example, is having surgery tomorrow? Wouldn't he prefer that I do something more useful in my life than running over to the Blessed Sacrament and kneeling in prayer? Evelyn Waugh captured this problem beautifully in his Sword of Honor trilogy. During his father's funeral mass, Guy Crouchback reflects on the problem of his own spiritual lethargy. For many years now, the direction in the Garden of the Soul, put yourself in the presence of God, had for Guy come to mean a mere act of respect, like the signing of the visitor's book at an embassy or government house. He reported for duty, saying to God, I don't ask anything from you. I'm here if you want me. I don't suppose I can be of any use, but if there is anything I can do, send me a text. I'm updating Waugh a bit, and he left it at that. I don't ask anything from you. Well, that was the deadly core of his apathy. That emptiness had been with him for years now, even in his days of enthusiasm and activity for the halberdiers. Enthusiasm and activity, however, were not enough. God required more than that. Here's the key sentence. He had commanded all men to ask. God commands us to ask. In other words, God has inscribed into his handbook for administering the providential order an important role for human agents. God needs our prayers, and that need is on display in the most prominent way imaginable in Exodus 32. With this in mind, I think we can cast new light on the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. In this story, Abraham, like Moses, is troubled by what God is about to do. He asks whether 50, 45, 30, even 10 righteous persons will be enough to spare the cities. God assures Abraham that 10 will be enough. But later, after God has destroyed the cities, we can assume that not even 10 righteous persons were to be found. But the story doesn't end there. In Genesis 19:29, we read, and if you have it on your handouts, I'm not sure I have a slide. No slide. So it was that when God destroyed the cities of the plain, God remembered, there's our key word again, God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow when he overthrew the cities in which Lot had settled. The fact that God remembered Abraham recalls both God's remembering of Noah, but also Moses' prayer that God remember his promises he made to Israel. What here in this text has God remembered? Well, I believe he was attentive to one matter which Abraham didn't mention in his supplication, but must have been the thing he thought about most deeply and most profoundly. And that would be the safety of his own immediate kinsman, Lot, and his family. In other words, God remembered the prayer Abraham was too humble to utter out loud. Before closing, let's take a look at what Benedict XVI has said about Moses' intercessory prayer. I think we'll see that Benedict XVI is exactly on the same page with everything we've drawn from Jewish sources and the Jewish scholar Yochanan Mufs. He writes this: "As with Abraham in regard to Sodom and Gomorrah, so also now God reveals to Moses what he intends to do, as though not wanting to act without his agreement. He says, quote, 'Let me alone that my wrath may burn hot.' But in reality," Benedict says, "let me alone is said precisely so that Moses will intervene and ask him not to do it, thereby revealing that God's desire is always to save." And then, going beyond simply Moses' role, Benedict also sees the relationship of this text to the phenomenon of intercessory prayer more generally. Intercessory prayer makes divine mercy so active within the corrupted reality of the sinful man that it finds a voice in the supplication of one who prays, and through him becomes present where salvation is needed. But then Benedict says a little bit more that I think will bring us back to the episode we saw in Breaking Bad. As with the two cities in the time of Abraham, punishment and destruction point to the gravity of the sin committed. At the same time, the intercessory's request is meant to manifest the Lord's will to forgive. This is the salvation of God, which involves mercy, but together with it exposes the truth of sin, of the evil that is present, so that the sinner, aware of and rejecting his own sin, can allow himself to be forgiven and transformed by God. In these words, I think we see the desires of Jesse expressed in the episode from Breaking Bad returning once more. Benedict XVI sees the back and forth between God and Moses as being ordered to the structure of intercessory prayer, to be sure, but he also sees the display, the threat of God's wrath as underscoring the true character of the evil that's been perpetrated. It can't be ignored. God's grace, as Dietrich Bonhoeffer so profoundly knew, is not cheap. It can only be offered once an honest appraisal of the sin itself has been made. Well, let me conclude by returning to the first page of your handout and reviewing those three texts with which I began. First, Genesis 6. The story of the flood puts us back in an era, we might say, of time before time. This is not a historical narrative in the simple sense of that term. Rather, in this story, as in many of the stories in Genesis 1 to 11, we see how God puts in place the conditions in which human life can flourish. One of those conditions being the establishment of the rule of law. And the importance of that, I think, was addressed quite well by the clip we saw from Breaking Bad. Second, we saw in Exodus 32 that this text bore only a superficial resemblance to Genesis 6. I say superficial because though it looks like God wants to destroy Israel in the same fashion in which he destroyed the world in Genesis 6, in fact, on deeper inspection, Exodus 32 is really expressing how deeply God wants Moses to intercede on behalf of the people he has sworn such deep fealty. And that intercession, I emphasized, should not be understood as an act of opposition to God, as though we're pitting man against God, but rather the ability, the gift, the grace, as it were, for a human being, here Moses, to participate in the mystery of God's own character or being. We must avoid the error of Guy Crouchback and think that our service of God consists simply of signing the guest book and then being on our way. God, Waugh was careful to note, commands us to ask. And finally, we saw that in Genesis 19, though there would be much more to say about that text if I had time this evening, but for our purposes, Genesis 19 is simply a variation on the issues that we have seen presented in Exodus 32. So in sum, I think we are able to answer the question posed by my lecture title with the abstract I was going to offer Carter. That is, with a resounding no, at least with respect to the three examples I have discussed this evening. I thank you for your time and your attention. Thank you.
Friends, now we have time for questions and engagement with our speaker, and I'm going to exercise the moderator's privilege and ask the first question, if I could, Gary. And I'm going to be a little bit unfair because I'm going to ask about something you didn't talk about. Does this pattern repeat itself in other contexts in the Old Testament when there are other events, God commands things that are somewhat shocking to our sensibilities? I'm thinking of punishing Saul for not fully executing his command in terms of wiping out the entirety of a city, and similar kinds of interventions involving what looks like the killing of men, women, and children and the like.
So you're addressing the problem of, in Hebrew the term is cherem, the ban. That's another problem. I can't, certainly while standing on one foot, address that this evening. That would take, I think the problem is addressable, perhaps not in every instance or in every detail made hospitable to morally sensitive souls, but I think that it's not certainly as bad as it looks at first blush. But no, in that story, I don't think that this particular dynamic is an evidence, though. This dynamic that we see with Moses at Exodus 32 becomes part and parcel of the definition of the prophet in ancient Israel, and we could point to many, many texts, and the book of Psalms as just laden with this particular spiritual demeanor of reminding God. In the Psalter, all the time, the Psalter reminds God of what he's done. And those reminders are never innocent. They're meant to put before God the striking lack of divine action on the behalf of the person, who's suffering. If you're the God who has done X, look at my situation now and notice the contradiction between the two. And that's how the psalmist puts his appeal before God. It's a deep pattern within the Old Testament Hebrew Bible.
Thank you very much. So please, friends, come to the microphones. We have microphones up top as well as down here, and engage our friend, Professor Anderson. And also introduce yourself before you speak, please.
Maya. I'm in Mufti, but I'm Father Bill Daly of the Congregation of Holy Cross. I run a little center for Notre Dame in Dublin. And in that role, I also preach every day. And sometimes I think I'm a halfway decent preacher, and then I listen to you, Gary, and realize how inadequate are my gifts. And my question, a bit like Carter's, goes a bit beyond the four corners of your presentation, which I found persuasive. But how, besides reading your books, I have them all, I'm reading them.
I don't care if people read my books, I just want them to buy them.
Just want us to buy them, yeah. How as ordinary, and in this sense, in comparison to you, right, though I'm ordained, I'm a lay reader of Scripture by comparison to yourself. How does a lay reader of Scripture wrestle with these texts to find this? Because you have a gift in teaching of sounding both as a scholar but as a believer, and the dynamic isn't merely scholarly, right, but it's a human being wrestling with God and finding him alive. Do you have any way to share with us how we might, in our own reading of these texts, have that freshness and that capacity for surprise that you bring in encountering them?
Oh, I wish I had an easy answer to that. I think all I can suggest is finding the authors that you believe are trustable and pursuing them in the text about which they're willing to comment. I wish there was one author, one commentary series, one set of resources I could send you to for the entire Christian Bible. I can't do that, unfortunately, but I think of the figures I mentioned tonight, I think that Yochanan Muffs is an extraordinary figure in having a profound theological sensibility at the same time being, really a philologian, historical critic without match. And I highly recommend almost everything he's written. Benedict XVI is amazing as well. One of my anxieties about posing the title I did for this lecture, especially, Carter's question, is that there's umpteen number of texts in the Old Testament and in the New, for that matter, that are problematic for, a modern reader. And I feared that in question and answer, I would simply get them all listed for me, and I would have to provide, in 5 seconds, an answer for all of them. I can't do that, but I picked these because they come out of my experience of teaching. There are also texts that are prominently, foregrounded by Dawkins. They're standard, and Marcion and other, heretics of the church. So they are representative. They're not certainly unrepresentative. But I think finding scholars that you can trust and reading them. I remember reading someone saying, with respect to the Talmud, authoritative Jewish source for law, which is mammoth. You look at it and you think, how could I ever begin? But, well, you begin with this and pursue this line and see how far it takes you with understanding. I think you have to find the authors you like, trust them, and go where they lead you. Up top.
Hi. I'm Dustin Crummett. I'm a post here at Notre Dame. So this line of questioning might also be some Carter's, but it is directly related to these passages. So I'm all about wrath and punishment and whatever. So I don't have a problem with the fact that God is punishing bad people in these passages. But I guess what's troubling to me is it seems like God must also be inflicting bad fates on a lot of innocents. The flood must have killed lots of babies and animals, and must have been plenty of babies in Sodom and Gomorrah, and God could have sent the kids with Lot and Abraham, but he doesn't. They get burned up too. So I wonder if the focus on justifying divine punishment, I think I agree with all of that, but I wonder if that doesn't paper over the most troubling aspect of these stories, which is that it looks like God punishes a bunch of people who couldn't have done anything.
So I remember once a good text that would illustrate, I think, the problem that you've just voiced is the line, it's in Exodus, but one can find it elsewhere, of God punishing the fathers, the children, the grandchildren, 3 generations. Two things would need to be said about that text, and I'm going to get to the specific nature of your question in just a second, but everyone forgets the fact that within the context of that verse, it said God's graciousness goes to 1,000 generations. His punitive wrath, we might say, goes to 3. So I think the context of the verse, of course, is to display for the reader the incommensurability between God's grace and his punishment. But I think that the other error that's often made by readers is we think of, and this confounds one's reading of many biblical passages, we think of sin in narrowly individualistic terms. I remember talking about this text once when I was at Princeton, New York University, as a fellow, and Michael Walzer was there, and he said, any political scientist knows the utter truth of these lines, because what these texts are really about, and what the Old Testament is more concerned of than with individual sins, are societal sins, is that when rulers or cultures do terrible things, let's think of the French and the British dividing up the Middle East after the fall of the Ottoman Empire in 1917 in a way that was completely artificial with respect to the people that lived there, it will be the succeeding generations, or if you want to think of the Portuguese and the slave trade from Africa to the New World, these were decisions made by singular, groups of people for whom the after effects of the sin rebounds over generations and affects innocent people that didn't perpetrate them, and they suffer. They suffer terribly. I think that's what these texts are about. When we do things wrong, a lot of people, fall, under the bus as a result of these actions. Part of the issue here, too, and this would address the way in which you frame the question, is the Bible, unlike Thomas Aquinas, doesn't always distinguish primary and secondary causation. So when it says God does this or God does that, I think frequently what one has to understand is God has ordered the world in such a way that, if you organize your society in such a way that you're bringing, slaves from Africa to the New World and, treating them the way they were treated, the problems generated by that societal sin are not going to go away in a generation. They're going to last. Or if you divide up, an entire people, the Arab people of the Middle East, in a completely phony fashion, as the way the French and the British did, then what's happening in Syria today, Lebanon, these are not big surprises. These weren't countries, under Ottoman rule. And one could multiply this, 100 times. One can look at, even the state of Germany today, the problem of integrating the East Germany, which remains difficult. And that was, only a generation of communist rule. But what it put in place was, a disaster. And lots of innocent people suffered from that. Babies, so on and so forth. So I think that, is a very important dimension to bring into these materials. And I guess I would, I agree with Michael Walser that there is more truth in these texts than actually, more moral problems. Again, given the sense that we recognize that the Bible, unlike Thomas Aquinas, is not interested in distinguishing neatly at every point primary and secondary causation. So God is ultimately the one that stands behind all of this, and the Bible is quite happy to say that. Figures like Thomas and the rest would not.
Thank you. My name is Jacob Horniker. I'm an undergraduate philosophy student from the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota. My question has to do with, first, the Breaking Bad scene and then a follow-up situation. So we see that Jesse underwent some sort of existential crisis when his evil acts were not judged as evil, so that he could then receive forgiveness. Mm-hmm. Is there a similar process when good acts go unacknowledged as good? Is there a similar existential crisis? And what happens when those acts are acknowledged as good? What's the gain there?
Yeah, I'm sure there is, but I guess the way you framed the question, I don't think quite captures what I wanted to say about Breaking Bad, and maybe what I had to say about Breaking Bad wasn't quite accurate. But I think, what we see in that episode, and I think it's actually part of the whole show. I mean, one of the things that's interesting about the show, at least to me, is that Jesse's drug usage, if you compare him, if you know the show, Walter White, who's squeaky clean with respect to drug usage, and you would think, oh, well, Walter White is the moral man because he doesn't condescend to this, but Jesse does. But Jesse actually is a deeply sensitive man. Walter is something of a sociopath, and Jesse senses the horror of the drug world. It's not just killing one man, but the whole world provides a kind of, moral ethos that is existentially for him unbearable. And one of the reasons he keeps returning to crystal meth and he does all of these other things is he just can't bear to see. I mean, he doesn't have the maturity to overcome it, but he doesn't have the barbarity of Walter White to simply kind of go home and kiss his wife and pretend everything's okay. He really sees what's going on, and that horrifies him. So this singular, for him, this is the crisis of killing Gail Bedecker that we saw in this episode is really just a kind of pars pro toto for Jesse of what he sees he's like he's living in Genesis 6. The world that he occupies, it is literally an underworld, is a world that he would prefer not to be part of. That, I think, is the profound crisis, and that, I think, is its tie. I mean, yes, good acts that aren't rewarded is certainly problematic, but I don't think it's on the order of living in a world in which evil of this nature is simply condoned, blinked on, and you just walk your own way.
Hi, my name is Alexander Mollison. I'm a Catholic. I'm a freshman at Holy Cross. And one of the recurring themes in the Bible is that God is all-powerful and all-knowing. If he's all-knowing, how would he... I'm just trying to see how he's getting Moses to try and talk him out of it? Would he have known that Moses would say, hey, don't do this? Or would he, not know and hope that Moses would try to talk him out of it?
So the Bible both has, profound philosophical and theological dimensions of which you've just illustrated, but it's also a narrative. And one of the things it wants to establish within the domain of its narrativity is the miracle of human freedom, which, given the fact that we are incommensurate with God, we'll never be able to square that with God's omniscience. So I'll give you there's many classic instances of this, of which theologians have worried about for generations, and for which they'll always worry because there are no answers. Let's give just two. In patristic homilies, when our angel Gabriel comes and asks, Mary at the Annunciation, will she be willing? Will she say, fiat mihi? Will she say yes to the proposal? The angels all stand on the edge of the balcony in bated breath, dying to know, because they know the whole future of creation depends on her answer. And the theological tradition wants to say she makes a freely chosen assent. But think about what that means. That means you have to concede that she could have said no. Well, what if she says no? Does God put the whole of human history at risk? Well, you want to say no, he hasn't, but you don't want to say he's forced his hand. And the same thing goes in the Garden of Gethsemane. Is that just like a puppetry? That, God's just playing with Jesus, but he's not really worrying? Well, there's tomes of ink, spilled on that one, and there'll never be a solution, because what we're speaking about on this issue is the impossibility of ever squaring the miracle of human freedom with God's providential ordering of the human race. It's not a solution, but the best, I might want to say, capsulization of the problem, I think, is provided in an essay I always have my undergraduates read by the great Israeli biblical scholar Uri Simon on the Genesis story, the Joseph story. It's a striking story because in its atmosphere, it's dramatically secular, meaning unlike the other stories in Genesis, God doesn't appear and tell any of the characters what to do. They make all their choices on the basis of their own mental, calculations, and many of those choices are horrible. The threat to kill Joseph being a great example of one. But at the end of the tale in chapter 50, the whole reconciliation scene, the whole denouement of the episode turns on Joseph saying, what you did, you intended for evil, but God used it all to achieve his good. And what Uri Simon says, and I think it's exactly right, is that free will does not cancel out divine providence. But think of also the implications. Does that mean that God willed that the brothers try to slay Joseph? No one would want to say that. That would be horrible. But God utilized the free choices of the brothers to do everything they did, and all the horrible choices of Joseph and all the horrible choices of Jacob. And lo and behold, poof, God's designs in the end, achieved their goals. That human freedom and divine predestination do not cancel one another out. How do they do so metaphysically? The Bible has no answer for that. It can only put you in front of the mystery, but it can't explain it.
Hi, my name's Andrew. I live here in South Bend. I'd say I agree with the questioner a few ones back who found some aspects of this talk unsatisfying, in that the problem of the evil of God in the Old Testament has never been about whether or not God judges people, but the disproportionate character of that judgment. So, for instance, the killing of the innocents in the flood of Noah, or we spoke about the Haram earlier. And an explanation about the systematic or systemic character of evil also seems inadequate, because we wouldn't say you can just commit genocide because there are larger cultural complexes at work than particular individual actions. And it seems like the early Christian community, whom none of us, I assume, would accused of moral therapeutic deism, also found these passages to be extremely problematic. In Origen, Athanasius, or even Augustine's own conversion was impossible before Ambrose introduced him to spiritual readings of these very passages in the Old Testament. So what is your position on the very typical response by both Eastern and Western patristics in spiritualizing these passages because of how horrific they are?
So I guess with the flood story, it would depend on whether you think, it's a historical episode. I think I said in my talk that it's the stories in Genesis 1 to 11, in my mind, are not, historical episodes the way in which the rest of the Hebrew Bible is. And Origen says as much as well. He doesn't say that about the flood, but he does say with respect to the Garden of Eden, who would ever believe that God was a gardener, blah, blah, blah. I don't think that's, that's outside the tradition to say such, but even if it was, I think it's clear to most readers that the flood story, whatever Augustine might have thought about its historicity, we'd be hard-pressed to find modern readers wanting to make that claim. So then one has to ask, well, what's it doing there?
Right.
And I don't think the story, the way I'd put it, you have to, I often get this from philosophers, you have to have a sense of genre. If you're watching The Lord of the Rings and they're attacking the fortress of Sauron, you're just thinking, destroy them, because you're thinking this is good versus evil. There probably are little babies on the other side of the wall, but the genre of the novel and its movieization isn't, that's not the question the writer wants you to ask. There are different genres in which that's a completely appropriate question. I'm not denying that that's an issue, but I think different genres raise different, issues for our consideration, and I think the flood story is, you can disagree with me, it's not going to offend me if you do, but I think it is raising the questions of what we saw in the episode of Breaking Bad, is who would want to live in a world in which there is no, there's no judicial force that will rein in human wickedness. And I think that's one of the themes that's going on in Genesis 1 to 11. Is how is God going to make the world? It's also part of Atrahasis and the Mesopotamian traditions about the flood, as well as how is God going to make the world a place in which human beings can flourish. And it takes God a while to achieve that. That's part of the anthropomorphic speech of Genesis 1 to 11. The other stories, again, Sodom and Gomorrah and the like, again, I think a lot of the fathers, the reason why in that story, and I can't remember what they say about Sodom and Gomorrah, but let's pretend Augustine is bothered by it. Or Gregory of Nyssa, it wouldn't be hard to imagine. But I think, again, the Bible says God does it, and they take that more literally than I would. I think these stories are, in the Old Testament, the distinction between primary and secondary causality is not something that exercised the writers. So when they ascribe things to divine action, that's not necessarily the only way in which they have to be understood. But the Bible does want to say that when peoples commit evils, the whole, Nazi Germany, the bombing of Germany by the Allies, lots of innocents suffered, and some of them unjustly. There were war crimes committed by the Allies, to be sure. But in a war, lots of innocents, even if you do everything possible not to have innocents suffer, innocents will suffer, because that's simply the nature of what war is. And if we think of these stories, or we think of this dimension of the Old Testament, which is dealing with peoples and civilizations, again, as Walzer would say, I just don't think the problem has quite the same force as it's often presented. It doesn't completely disappear, but it doesn't have quite the same force, I think, you're ascribing to it.
I'm Teresa Breckler. I'm a freshman at Holy Cross College across the street. And I was wondering, God, it talks about how he regrets, and it seems that he changes his mind a lot. But as I understood, and this might be incorrect, since God is infinite, I thought that he remained the same since he's outside of time. So how do you address how that is written and put forth as though God does change?
That's related to the mystery of intercessory prayer. Why does he want me to pray for my Aunt Myrtle? According to your logic, I shouldn't. Guy Crouchback, I should just sign the guest book and let God take care of the universe. Intercessory prayer is an incredible thing. God wants somehow, in God's own being, he wants us to ask, and when we ask, he will, quote, change his mind. That is, what I tried to give in my example. Again, you don't have to accept it, but the story of the Bible is speaking in the language of human experience. It has no other way to frame it than to describe it this way. Is that who God is in se? Well, I think we'd have to ask Thomas Aquinas if that's how God is in se. Perhaps we want to say no, but in terms of the way in which the narrative logic of the story is going to flow, the way in which we're going to explain as limited, finite human beings how it can be that I can pray for somebody, God will hear it, and then my prayer will be answered. One says, well, what if I didn't pray? Again, these are they're insoluble problems. But the Bible takes the risk of it would rather say God changed his mind, or to Abraham, now I know that you fear God. What, didn't God not know before? No, that God knows now. The Bible wants to inscribe in the reader the importance of Abraham's decision. There's something about human freedom that, is simply miraculous, impossible to get one's head around. And the Bible is going to take the risk of making, God a character, not to erase that dimension of human experience.
Yes.
Okay, my name is Kenny Urlakis. I'm a graduate philosophy major at the University of St. Thomas in Minnesota. You may have just answered my question. So earlier in your lecture regarding intercessory prayer, you said that God needs our prayer. And I have a worry that this might touch on God's omnipotence. Could you say a little more about that?
Kind of going in and out like a bad cell phone connection. I'm hearing every other word.
Keep close to the microphone.
Okay, is this better?
Yes.
Okay, my question. Earlier in your lecture, you said that God needs our prayer.
Mm-hmm.
How does this not impinge on God's omnipotence?
How does it not impinge on what?
Omnipotence.
Omnipotence. I have no idea.
Good answer.
What do you want to say? That God then doesn't need our prayers? That's your choice. It's like Mary and all the angels. What if she says no?
Just because she's not going to say no. She's the Blessed Mother, just to be clear. She could, but she didn't. And
there we go. But the problem is that you have to, if you're going to make it a free decision, you have to entertain the other possibilities. So if we want to extol Mary for her free choice, then we have to reckon with the possibility that she could have said no. So what does God put the whole universe at risk? Well, there's no answering that question.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Jim, you want to?
Yes, James Stoner, Louisiana State University. I've been trying to think of the Cajun joke, which would be, well, he just would have asked another girl. But the serious question, are you distinguishing between God's justice and God's mercy? So to go back to the question, is the God of the Old Testament evil? Would it be two different questions? Is he evil because unjust, or evil because unmerciful? And it seems to me that the intercessions of Abraham and Moses are different on this score. That Abraham is interceding for the righteous men, right? And therefore is calling into question God's justice. Whereas Moses isn't justifying what was done in his absence in worshiping the golden calf, but presumably is pleading for God's mercy.
The difference, in my view, between Abraham and Moses, I hope this doesn't offend anybody, but it's like going to the customer service desk at Walmart. And let's imagine that you've got a product you bought at Walmart that failed, but you don't have the receipt. So you have no legal hold on Walmart to give you your money back. So if that's your situation, when you walk into the store with your toaster and you've lost the receipt, you meet the lady behind, or the man, don't want to be sexist, behind the customer service desk, and you're going to be very polite. you're going to say, well, this is a great company. I know you want to stand by your product, blah, blah, blah. And, maybe 9 times out of 10, you're going to get what you wish. Moses has got the receipt. God said that, he promised Abraham, blah, blah, blah. And Moses can stand up there and, he says, remember, look, it's written right here. And he can be much more direct and demanding. At least to me, that's the difference between the two stories. He is asking about the righteous, but I think the important element that's frequently forgotten by individuals, they don't read to the end of the story, is the element I mentioned, is that as Abraham runs to look down at Sodom and Gomorrah when the smoke is rising, not simply because he's interested in a moral problem, though he is, and that's what God wants to teach, and that's what God says at the beginning of 18, but he's also concerned about his family members, right? And that's why the story ends. God remembered. What did he remember? He knew what Abraham was really asking about, and he delivered that family. At least for me, that's a key element that's frequently forgotten there, and they didn't rise to the number of 10, but they were individuals who were righteous that God, wasn't going to be unjust and to destroy. That's how I read it in any event.
Please join me in thanking Professor Anderson once again. And friends, as always, we can continue our conversation outside in the atrium with some refreshments and wonderful kickoff to the beginning. Thank you, Gary.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Is that yours?
Yes.